welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty fundamental, aren't we? It's this basic tension in being human.
Absolutely. It's that paradox, right? We have this incredible drive, this ambition to achieve things, to be happy even.
Yeah, constantly pushing forward. But then underneath it all, there's often this sense of philosophical hopelessness lurking, a conflict.
That conflict is exactly our focus. We're going to explore that whole spectrum today, from the really deep pessimism to these ideas of existential resilience.
And we're drawing on some heavy hitters here.
Oh, yeah. Schopenhauer, Camus, Benatar, Gray, Ligotti, the list goes on. We're synthesizing their views to get past just, positive versus negative thinking.
Right. So the mission for you, listening, is to really grapple with this question. How do you live authentically? How do you stay engaged when you're staring potential meaninglessness and, let's face it, inevitable suffering right in the face?
We'll be digging into some challenging concepts. Anti-natalism, the absurd, even the idea that consciousness itself might be, a bit of a curse. Existential horror.
It sounds like it demands a certain intellectual honesty.
It really does. If the world is harsh, if it's indifferent, what's the most rational way forward? Maybe even the most ethical way? That's what we're analyzing.
Okay, so let's start with that core agreement among the pessimists. This idea that suffering isn't just like an occasional bad day. It's central, inevitable.
And that really begins with Schopenhauer, doesn't it? His radical starting point.
Which is?
That life basically boils down to one of two states. You're either in pain or you're in boredom. That's the fundamental oscillation.
Pain or boredom, that's stark.
It is. He argued that suffering is the defining thing, what we call happiness or pleasure. For Schopenhauer, that's not really a positive thing in itself.
He called it negative happiness.
Exactly. Pleasure is just the temporary absence of pain. It's the moment the ache stops, not some blissful state you arrive at.
Okay, that distinction feels really important and pretty depressing if you think about it for too long.
Well, yeah. If pleasure is just relief from pain, then you can't really achieve lasting contentment, can you? Structurally impossible.
You're just bouncing between the two. Pain makes you want relief.
And then you get relief, and almost immediately what hits you? Boredom. Which, Schopenhauer says, quickly becomes its own kind of suffering because the underlying will needs something new to latch onto.
The will. Let's unpack that a bit. What did he mean by the will to live?
It's this blind, relentless, sort of striving energy that he believed drives everything. It's not rational. It has no ultimate goal. It just pushes.
Like an engine that never switches off.
Precisely. And it's never satisfied. You satisfy one desire, say, you eat when you're hungry, and the will just instantly creates a new one. You're trapped on this. Well, what psychologists now might call the hedonic treadmill.
Always running, never really getting anywhere permanently satisfying.
You got it. And even those moments of relief, those fleeting pleasures, Schopenhauer points out they're often tainted.
How so?
Because we know they won't last. We immediately start worrying about losing them. That anxiety about impermanence just adds another layer of dissatisfaction. Even the good bits are shadowed by the knowledge they'll end.
Wow. Okay, so this fundamental dissatisfaction, this structural problem, it leads these thinkers to question consciousness itself.
Yes, exactly. Schopenhauer and later Benatar, and especially someone like Thomas Ligotti, they start to see self-awareness not as evolution's greatest gift, but as a crushing burden, an evolutionary flaw.
Because we can think about things like death.
Right. We can analyze our own mortality. We can reflect on the past, worry about the future, understand decay. Animals don't seem to do that, do they?
They experience pain, fear, but maybe just in the moment. They operate on instinct.
That's the idea. They're spared what these philosophers call existential confusion and anxiety. They aren't contemplating the absurdity of it all or dreading something years down the line.
But we are. We have this reflective capacity. You can imagine infinite possibilities.
And then get profoundly anxious because we know we can't achieve them all in one finite life. We understand our limits in a way an animal presumably doesn't. That ability to analyze, it deepens the anguish.
And Ligotti takes this to the absolute extreme, doesn't
he? He really does. It's not just a burden for him. Consciousness is an unwanted condition, something that fundamentally causes pain and, he argues, maybe shouldn't have happened at all.
He calls it a horror, an error.
Yes, a philosophical horror. His view is incredibly bleak. He thinks most of us have to live in a state of self-deception, pretending life is meaningful, because facing the truth of existence, its indifference, its potential horror is just too much. The mind can't really handle the reality it perceives.
Which leads us to a really tough question, doesn't it? If digging deep, if being truly intellectually honest about all this, if that leads to more anguish, is genuine honesty fundamentally incompatible with psychological comfort?
That's the uncomfortable implication, isn't it? That achieving comfort might require deliberately looking away or adopting comforting illusions, that the price of clarity might actually be, well, peace of mind.
A heavy price. Okay, let's move into how this diagnosis leads to some radical ethical conclusions.
Right. So if consciousness is potentially an error and existence is structurally geared towards suffering, where does that take you ethically? It leads us straight to David Benatar and anti-natalism.
Anti-natalism, the idea that bringing new human life into the world is actually morally wrong.
Precisely. Because suffering is guaranteed, Benatar argues, creating new sufferers is an act of harm. It violates a basic ethical duty to prevent harm.
Now, this isn't just an emotional reaction, is it? He builds a logical case.
A very tight logical case. It's called the asymmetry argument, and it's key to understanding his whole position. It argues that coming into existence is always a net negative because of an imbalance between pain and pleasure.
Okay, let's break that asymmetry down carefully, step by step.
Sure, so start with existing people. 2 simple points. First, pain is bad for someone who exists. Second, pleasure is good for someone who exists. Pretty straightforward, right?
Seems obvious enough. Pain bad, pleasure good. Got it.
Okay, now, think about non-existence, someone who is never born. What happens in that state?
Well, they don't experience pain, obviously.
Right, non-existence prevents pain. And Benatar argues that preventing pain is good. Even if there's no one there to consciously appreciate the lack of pain, the absence of harm is itself a positive outcome, a good realized state.
Okay. Preventing harm is good. Makes sense. What about pleasure? They don't experience pleasure either.
Correct. Non-existence also prevents pleasure. And here's the crucial asymmetrical step. Benatar claims preventing pleasure is not bad.
Not bad. Why?
Because there's no one there being deprived. You need an existing person, a subject, to be harmed by the lack of pleasure. Since there's no entity in non-existence feeling deprived, the absence of potential pleasure isn't a negative, it's neutral.
So let me see if I've got this. Avoiding pain is good, a positive. Avoiding pleasure is not bad, neutral.
Exactly. The good of pleasure requires someone to enjoy it. But the good of avoiding pain doesn't require someone to feel relief. Simply not causing harm is good in itself.
Okay, I can see the logic, but my intuition is screaming a bit here.
Yeah.
What about the sheer joy life can hold? The potential. Doesn't that count?
Benatar acknowledges joy exists, but he'd say the guarantee of suffering, even minor suffering, let alone major trauma, tips the scales. The asymmetry argument says avoiding definite harm, pain, is a stronger moral imperative than enabling potential benefit, pleasure, especially when the absence of that benefit harms no one.
So putting it together, existence guarantees some suffering, a definite negative. Non-existence guarantees avoiding suffering, a definite positive or neutral state, and causes no negative by preventing pleasure. Therefore,
coming into existence is always, logically speaking, within his framework, a net harm. And procreation becomes ethically problematic because it imposes this harm on someone without their consent.
That's a profoundly challenging idea. It basically reframes every birth as a morally questionable act.
It does, and it ties back to Schopenhauer's critique of optimism, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The biological drive to reproduce, driven by that blind will, overrides any rational ethical calculation about the suffering involved.
But Benatar makes a really important distinction, doesn't he? He argues against creating new life, but he doesn't advocate for suicide for people already here. Why the different calculation?
Because once you do exist, things change. You have consciousness, needs, relationships, a powerful instinct for self-preservation. The act of dying itself involves suffering, and it causes suffering for others.
So the harm calculation shifts. While existence itself might have been a net negative to start, ending it now could create even more harm for the existing person and those connected to them.
Exactly. The ethical landscape is completely different once someone has a life, a will to live of their own, however flawed the initial decision to bring them here might have been.
John Gray touches on this too, right? Though maybe from a slightly different angle. He agrees existence is tough, but maybe pushes back on condemning it entirely.
Gray's perspective is maybe less about the ethics of creation and more about just accepting the randomness. He sees life as biological, ultimately meaningless, and maybe suggests that condemning it, like Benatar does, still assigns it a kind of moral weight or purpose that Gray thinks is illusory in the first place.
So Gray's more about acknowledging the pointlessness and trying to live with it, rather than making a moral judgment against it.
Something like that. He seems less concerned with arguing with fate and more with recognizing it as blind causation. But yeah, the common thread is this deep skepticism about existence being inherently beneficial or tilted towards satisfaction.
Okay, so we have this deep philosophical pessimism about existence itself. How does this translate into a view of society, of progress, of hope?
Well, it leads to a pretty severe critique, especially aimed at modern ideas of progress. John Gray is particularly scathing here.
What's his main line of attack?
He fundamentally rejects the idea that human history shows a steady march of improvement guided by reason. Instead, he argues, history is mostly a cycle of recurring mistakes. We keep messing up in the same ways, driven by our basic, unchanging animal instincts, not by Enlightenment ideals.
So the belief that science, technology, rational thought will lead us to a better future. Gray sees that
as basically a secularized version of religious faith. We've swapped hope in God for hope in technology. We expect science and policy to deliver a kind of earthly salvation, replacing the promise of heaven. He thinks it's a deeply ingrained form of cultural self-deception.
And this ties into a pessimism about technology itself, doesn't it? The idea that tech doesn't actually solve our fundamental problems.
Exactly. Because the problems, suffering, mortality, the drives of the will, our flawed nature are seen as intrinsic. Technology might change the surface, but it doesn't touch the core issues. In fact, sometimes it makes them worse.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about weaponry. Technology gives us vastly more efficient ways to destroy ourselves. We're capable of annihilation on a scale unimaginable before. That's hardly progress in a fundamental human sense.
Or maybe communication tech. We're more connected than ever, arguably. But people report feeling more lonely, more anxious due to comparison on social media.
Precisely. It creates new forms of psychological suffering. The underlying existential anxieties, finding meaning, connection, dealing with finitude, they don't go away. They just get expressed through new technological channels.
And Schopenhauer saw this coming centuries ago.
He did. He argued that no matter how clever our inventions, they wouldn't alleviate the fundamental suffering inherent in existence, because that suffering comes from the endless striving of the will, not from a lack of gadgets.
The sources also mention that tech often reinforces existing problems, like inequality, or gets used for control.
Yeah, that's a strong point in the critique. Advances don't automatically benefit everyone equally. Often they concentrate power, enhance surveillance, or create new divides, rather than lifting the entire human condition.
Roger Scruton had some thoughts on this too, about the psychology of technological optimism.
Yes, Scruton saw it as a kind of psychological crutch. This relentless optimism about technology and progress allows people to avoid confronting the difficult, messy reality of human nature and our limitations. It points us towards impossible utopias.
And he saw that as dangerous. More dangerous than despair, even.
He did, because despair, while painful, might at least be based on a realistic assessment. But false hope, Scruton argued, blinds you. It prevents you from seeing problems clearly and taking real action because you're always waiting for the next big fix, the utopian solution just around the corner. Dropping that false hope is necessary to actually face reality.
Which brings us to politics. If pessimism is more realistic, but society seems to run on optimism, what does that mean for how societies function?
Both Schopenhauer and Gray argue, quite provocatively, that society needs illusions to function. Political systems, religious frameworks, they often act as essential delusions that provide stability and cohesion.
How so?
People need to believe, generally, that things can get better, that their efforts matter, that there's some overarching purpose or justice. These shared beliefs, even if ultimately unfounded, according to the pessimists, are what hold the social fabric together. Gray mentions people clinging to the idea they can achieve happiness even if suffering is structural. These illusions are like social glue.
But there's a dark side to that reliance on hope, especially when it becomes ideological.
A very dark side. Scruton warned about utopian political movements. When a movement believes it has the blueprint for a perfect society, and human nature doesn't fit that blueprint. While history shows these movements often turn totalitarian.
They try to forcibly re-engineer people to fit the vision.
Exactly. If the people are the problem preventing utopia, the people must be changed, often violently. You see this in literature, too, like Orwell's 1984.
Right, where the party uses constant propaganda about progress and manufactured happiness to control the population. Optimism becomes mandatory.
Yes, because pessimism, seeing things as they are, becomes a form of resistance. It threatens the state's narrative.
So this raises another big question. If pessimism offers a more accurate picture, does that mean societies built on optimistic illusions are inherently fragile?
The analysis certainly suggests they might be. A society constantly papering over cracks with manufactured hope is potentially unstable because it's not addressing the real underlying issues.
Whereas a society, or maybe even just an individual, willing to face the difficult truths might be more resilient in the long run.
Possibly. Because they're dealing with reality, not fantasy. Confronting actual problems, however unpleasant, might lead to better outcomes than chasing illusions. Genuine resistance, in this view, begins with dismantling those necessary social lies, at least in your own mind.
Okay, so the pessimists have laid out a powerful, intellectually consistent case. It's bleak, it's challenging, but is that the only response? Does diagnosis dictate the prescription?
Not necessarily, and this is where we bring in the crucial countervoice, particularly Albert Camus.
Camus. He doesn't disagree with the diagnosis, does he? He accepts the absurdity.
Completely. He starts from the same place. Life is absurd, the universe is indifferent, there's no inherent meaning or purpose. But crucially, he rejects the conclusions of despair or surrender.
He rejects suicide, both physical and philosophical.
Yes. Physical suicide for Camus is giving up too soon, putting the sword down even before fighting. And philosophical suicide is escaping the absurdity by leaping into faith, into dogma, whether religious or ideological, something that falsely promises answers and dissolves the tension.
So what's his alternative? If you accept the absurdity but reject surrender.
His third way, revolt and embrace. This is the heart of existential resilience for Camus. Meaning isn't found out there. It's created by us through our defiance of the absurd.
So consciousness, which Ligotti saw as a horror, Camus sees as the tool for rebellion.
Precisely. Consciousness allows us to recognize the absurdity, and in that recognition, we find the power to revolt against it. It's not about changing the indifferent universe, it's about changing our attitude towards it.
He talks about the absurd hero, right? What defines this hero?
The absurd hero is someone who achieves lucid reason, noting its limits. They see clearly that there's no ultimate meaning, they understand that limitation, but they choose to live passionately and intensely anyway. That conscious choice, that embrace of the struggle despite its pointlessness, is the heroic act.
And the perfect image for this is Sisyphus.
Yes, the myth of Sisyphus. Condemned by the gods to eternally push a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down each time. It seems like the ultimate symbol of futile, meaningless labor.
But Camus finds triumph there. How?
In Sisyphus's consciousness of his fate, especially, Camus imagines, in that moment when Sisyphus walks back down the hill to retrieve the boulder. In that moment, he is aware of the full extent of his wretched condition.
As it's pointless.
He knows. And yet, he turns and walks down to do it again. In that lucid awareness and scorn for the fate imposed upon him, Sisyphus becomes, for Camus, superior to his rock. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The meaning is created in the defiance, not the outcome.
That's a powerful reinterpretation. Okay, so if revolt is key, how does something like art fit in? This seems like a point where these thinkers diverge quite a bit.
It really is. For Camus, art and creativity are prime forms of rebellion. Creating a novel, a painting, music, it's imposing human meaning, form, and value onto a chaotic and meaningless world. Art is resistance.
But Ligotti would completely disagree with that, wouldn't he?
Absolutely. Consistent with his view, Ligotti sees art, even his own horror fiction, which might seem to reveal dark truths, as ultimately just another sophisticated form of escapism. A brain manipulation, as the source puts it.
Just another way to avoid facing the truly horrific reality of existence. An opiate for the thinking person.
That's essentially his take. It might feel profound, but it's still a distraction, a way of managing the terror rather than truly confronting it.
And Schopenhauer. He had a view on art, too, somewhere between these two.
Yes, Schopenhauer offers an interesting middle ground. He saw aesthetic experience, especially listening to music, as offering genuine but temporary relief.
Relief from what?
From the relentless striving of the will to live. When you're absorbed in art, he argued, you momentarily stop being a bundle of desires and needs. You become a pure, detached observer, a will-less subject of knowledge.
So it's an escape, but maybe an authentic one, not just a delusion, a brief pause from the suffering machine.
Exactly. It's a temporary stepping outside of the cycle of desire, pain, and boredom. Real relief, but fleeting. It doesn't solve the fundamental problem, but it provides moments of genuine respite.
Okay, so 3 different takes on art. Camus sees it as active rebellion and meaning-making. Ligotti sees it as clever avoidance or delusion. Schopenhauer sees it as temporary, authentic relief from the will. That's fascinating.
So we've seen the philosophical arguments, the critiques of society, the existentialist counter-rebellion. But we also need to consider the psychological impact of all this. Confronting meaninglessness isn't easy, emotionally speaking.
No, you'd imagine it could lead to, well, despair, depression, kind of paralysis.
Yeah.
Existential psychologists like Yalom talk about this, right? Dealing with the givens of existence.
Yes, Yalom identifies 4 ultimate concerns: death, freedom, and the responsibility that comes with it, isolation, and meaninglessness. How we cope with these is central to our mental health.
And this connects to that fascinating psychological concept, depressive realism. What's the core idea there?
It's this paradoxical finding, first really explored by Alloy and Abramson and discussed by thinkers like Feltham. It suggests that people who are mildly depressed or have a more pessimistic outlook might actually have a more accurate perception of reality.
More accurate.
They seem less susceptible to certain optimistic biases that healthier or happier people often have. They might have a clearer view of their own limitations, their degree of control over events, and the actual likelihood of negative outcomes. They see the world perhaps a little less through rose-tinted glasses.
So the optimists might be happier, but the pessimists might be righter.
That's the provocative idea. The depressive realists achieve a kind of superior reality testing, but the price they pay is often lower mood, less motivation.
Which raises the question again. If pessimism is closer to the truth, why is optimism the default setting society seems to demand?
Well, society often needs that optimism to function, as we discussed. R.D. Laing made a powerful case that society often coerces us into suppressing our suffering and our more realistic, perhaps darker, assessments.
You have to put on a brave face, maintain a false self, just to fit in and be considered normal or productive.
Exactly. The person who constantly points out the negative realities, even if accurately, risks being labeled dysfunctional, depressed, a downer. There's immense social pressure to maintain at least the appearance of optimism.
So if you're feeling that existential angst, that despair, forcing yourself to be falsely optimistic isn't the answer, according to existential therapy.
No. Thinkers like Viktor Frankl, who developed logotherapy after his experiences in concentration camps, argued the path forward isn't denying the meaninglessness, but creating personal meaning within it.
You accept the universe doesn't offer inherent value, and that frees you up to find value for yourself, based on your own authentic choices and experiences.
Precisely. Meaning becomes subjective, something you build, not something you find prepackaged. This offers a way out of nihilistic despair without resorting to comforting illusions.
This sounds less like Ligotti's horror and maybe even less strenuous than Camus's constant heroic revolt. Is there another model here?
There is. The work of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa offers a fascinating alternative path.
Pessoa. How does his approach differ?
Pessoa suggests taking all that existential pain, the boredom, the sense of emptiness, and instead of fighting it or despairing over it, transforming it into material for aesthetic mental contemplation.
So not fighting it, not denying it, but observing it, almost like Schopenhauer's view of art, but applied to life itself.
In a way, yes, it's a much gentler approach. Pessoa argued that a life without cosmic purpose is actually free from impossible demands, crushing expectations, false hopes. He suggests accepting things quietly, gently.
Turning the suffering itself into something beautiful, or at least interesting to contemplate.
Yes. Finding a serene beauty in the observation of it all. Releasing the resistance. He advises experiencing life almost like a floating fantasy, appreciating the sensory details, the moments, without demanding they add up to some grand narrative. It's finding peace in observation and acceptance.
That feels like a very different texture of pessimism. Less conflict, more quiet reflection.
It really is. It takes the accurate diagnosis of pessimism, but shifts the response away from anguish or heroic struggle towards a kind of peaceful, detached engagement.
And all these threads, accepting suffering like Schopenhauer, acknowledging realism like Feltham, but avoiding despair and maybe the exhausting nature of constant revolt, they lead to this final synthesis presented in the source material, lucid resignation.
Exactly. Lucid resignation is framed as a kind of sustainable pessimism, a way to live authentically, knowing the score without falling into nihilism or false hope.
What's the formula again? Is something like
living meaningful existence plus authenticity, active withdrawal plus destruction. So it embraces meaningful, authentic living, but subtracts withdrawal from the world and destructive impulses. It's described as a resignation of revolt and embrace.
Okay, so what does that actually look like in practice?
It means accepting the reality of suffering and meaninglessness. It means rejecting easy answers, utopian fantasies, and mandatory optimism. But it also means rejecting despair, apathy, and self-destruction.
So you stay engaged. You participate in life.
Yes, actively, but you do so without illusions. You don't expect external validation or cosmic rewards. Your engagement is driven by your own, honestly chosen values and commitments, fully aware of the difficult context. The goal isn't necessarily happiness or salvation.
What is the goal then?
The goal is clearness, balance, personal freedom, the kind of freedom that comes from confronting reality head-on without flinching and then choosing how to act anyway.
So it keeps the clear-sightedness of pessimism, but ditches the potentially paralyzing or destructive conclusions. It finds a way to be realistic and productive.
That's the aim, to navigate the harsh realities ethically and constructively without succumbing to either comforting lies or crippling despair. It's about finding a way to live well with the truth, not despite it. #outro best.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground today. From consciousness as a potential burden,
Through the stark logic of anti-natalism,
the critique of progress, the defiance of Camus.
and landing finally on this idea of lucid resignation via Pessoa's gentle contemplation.
It really underscores the intellectual honesty involved in pessimism, doesn't it? Facing those uncomfortable truths about suffering, meaninglessness, truths that maybe our society often tries to sweep under the rug.
It does. But as we concluded, pessimism, when understood properly, perhaps, as lucid resignation, doesn't have to be paralyzing. It can actually be an agent of freedom.
Freedom from what?
Freedom from mandatory happiness. Freedom from the pressure of societal illusions about inevitable progress. Freedom from false hopes that are constantly being dashed. By seeing things clearly, you gain a kind of intellectual independence.
And maybe a more honest ethical fitting, because you're not basing your actions on wishful thinking.
Exactly. It pushes you towards a relationship with the world that's self-authored, based on your own lucid assessment, not on comforting narratives handed down to you.
So, thinking about the listener, we've seen the core question isn't really if life has some grand objective value. It's more about how we choose to live, how we create value ourselves, knowing that objective value might be absent.
Right. And that leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. If our social and political systems often seem to rely on a certain level of manufactured optimism to function, to maintain cohesion, what responsibility do we have? If we recognize the harsher realities, how do we stay genuinely engaged and constructive? How do we avoid falling into either utopian dreaming on one side or just cynical paralysis on the other?
Lucid resignation suggests a path. Stay active, stay committed, but do it on your own terms, with open eyes. Engage with the world, but without the illusions. That might be the most authentic stance we can take.